Good. So title of today's talk will be The Return of Prohibition and Ritual. This is a talk that is based on a talk I gave some weeks ago in the also Sprague Zarathustra conference organized by Cadel Last. But I changed a couple of things, and I think it will be sufficiently different to be interesting. So what's on the menu today? So first, a bit of background. So I am a researcher in machine learning, artificial intelligence, bioinformatics. So I'm very interested in the interplay between, let's say, the ancient human and the modern digital world. So modern human is about 300,000 years old. Behavioral modernity, fire, trade, symbols, and music is about 50,000 years old. And in contrast, the internet is very new, only about 30 years old, and by next year we will have also something like 43 billion devices hooked up to the internet. So I'm very interested in the interplay between modern technology, machine learning, digital networks, and archaic humanity. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very interested in the topics and the thinkers that I will be talking about today. So here are a couple of people who thought really deep and hard about humans and what makes humans tick. There's Freud to the left, Jung in the middle, Lacan to the right. Very interesting thinkers, but they will not be center stage today. And as Andrew already pointed out, I have a great interest in this guy, Rene Girard, historian, literary critic, philosophical anthropologist. He died in 2015. He was born in France, but he spent most of his time in the States, and he had an academic career. So this is not a new age thinker. It's somebody deeply embedded in academia. He was at Johns Hopkins in Stanford, and he was also a member of the Académie Française. So he wrote a couple of classic books. So here are some of his famous books: Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, 1961, Violence and the Sacred, 1972. And then his magnum opus that I highly recommend. We're currently reading it, me, Owen, and Daniel Fraga, and doing a series of podcasts about this book, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, which summarizes his thinking. But today I will confront Rene Girard with his arch enemy, so to say, and that is, of course, Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche is also a thinker about human nature. I would say he's actually more of a valuable as a thinker about human nature and about psychology and as a philosopher. And here's a quote from Ecce Homo: that a psychologist without equal speaks from my writings is perhaps the first insight reached by a good reader. So we're going to confront Nietzsche with Girard in this talk and see what comes out of that. So here's a quote from also Sprague Zarathustra, by Nietzsche, of course. The section is called on Enjoying and Suffering the Passions, and Nietzsche writes, "Once you had passions and called them evil, but now you have only your virtues. They grew out of your passions. You set your highest goal in the heart of those passions. Then they became your virtues and joys. And though you were of the race of the hot-tempered, or of the lustful, or of the fanatical, or the vengeful, in the end, all your passions became virtues and all your devils angels. Once you had wild dogs in your cellar, but they changed at last into birds and charming singers." I think that this is a very interesting passage, and I will use this passage to confront Nietzsche with Girard, and also investigate the role of prohibition and ritual in the life of humans. So I will return to this passage later on. So let's take a look at some of the ideas of Girard. So this is becoming fairly well known. Girard is becoming a fairly well known teacher, and one of his thinker, and one of his central ideas is that our desire is mimetic. We don't really have any individual desire. There is no individual self that has deep desires, but we actually pick up our desires from those around us. So desire is always triangular. So there is a subject, there is a mediator or a model, and then there's an object. So we basically want what our models also want. And this is why advertisement works. So here to the right, you see Mr. George Clooney, and he has an Omega watch. And basically, we are the subjects. We look at George Clooney and he becomes our model. And because the model desires this watch, we also this watch. So advertisers, they know very well that mimetic desire is triangular, and they make good use of it. So it's important to note that this is not just a tendency. We do not have just a tendency to want what other people want. Beyond very basic needs, such as the need for food, the need for water, and so on, all our desires are picked up from those around us. So this is a very fundamental aspect of humans. And basically, we can consider ourselves, the self of a human is basically a collection of desires that were picked up from models, from those around them. Now, mimetic desire can easily get into mimetic rivalry. So consider a subject and a mediator that are very close together. They, for example, desire the same woman, the same partner, the same prestigious job. So very easily, mimetic desire can turn into mimetic rivalry, and people start fighting about anything, and so they can even start fighting over a pickled herring if prestige is involved, as you can see here in this painting by James Ensor. Now, mimetic rivalry, as a result of mimetic desire, can quickly get out of hand. So you can get mimetic crisis, you can get undifferentiation. People start retaliating, copying each other's aggression, and this can lead to widespread havoc. This is an example from the 17th century, from the religious wars in Europe. We had the 30 Years' War, which is a war between Catholics and Protestants, both Christians. At least that's what they claim to be. But that was one of the bloodiest wars in the history of mankind. Up to 60% mortality in certain regions of Germany.
Doing the same presentation, Julia.
And yeah, there's somebody should mute their mic, I think. So this is an example how mimetic rivalry can escalate, and how this can lead to enormous bloodshed. So how do you get out of the crisis? Well, so how do you avoid this? So how do you get rid of rivalry? Not by talking, but by basically projecting all your aggression on a scapegoat. And this is one of the reasons why so many tribes and so many cultures they slaughter scapegoats. This is basically to channel the aggression of the tribe, of the community onto a scapegoat, and by killing the scapegoat, you pacify the entire society. This is not something that's only been done by so-called primitive tribes, but you can kind of see Nazism as an attempt to bring back the scapegoating mechanism on an industrial scale. So desire is extremely dangerous, and of course, in the course of human evolution, so we have developed ways to deal with the dangerous nature of desire, and that, of course, is nothing else than religion. And religion has basically two technologies to avoid the problems that come with desire and with mimetic desire and mimetic rivalry. And the first technology that religion uses is basically prohibition. It's going to set limits to desire. And this is one of the reasons that nearly all religions, they have very clear teachings around sexuality. They try to curb sexuality. And that's, of course, because sexuality is a great source of mimetic desire and a great source of mimetic rivalry. So religion will set limits to it, will set limits to sexuality and to other activities that can cause mimetic rivalry. And so one of the great technologies of religion is prohibition. Now, there is a problem with prohibition. And the problem with prohibition, that, of course, it can lead to paralysis. So this is what Rene Girard writes in his magnum opus, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. So cohabitant groups are paralyzed by prohibitions. In fact, if there were nothing but prohibitions, these groups would perish from inactivity. So the problem with prohibition is that it can lead to stagnation. To have so many rules and regulations that it might, for example, around sexuality, it might be difficult to find a sexual partner. So a solution needs to be found, and a way needs to be found to kind of break these prohibitions and relax them, and do things that go beyond that go beyond the time where prohibitions are active. So Girard writes, this new type of interaction, so interaction that goes beyond prohibition, would take shape as a series of exchanges regulated and symbolized by sacrificial ritual. So here we have it. So we not only have times of prohibition, but we also have times of ritual. So this is the second big technology that is offered by religion. So in ritual time, the prohibitions are lifted, the prohibitions are broken. That's a very, very dangerous time, because these prohibitions are there to avoid mimetic escalation. And that means that when you break these prohibitions, you're immediately going to also provide scapegoats, so you can project all the problems, all the aggression that comes from breaking these prohibitions, you can project that immediately onto a scapegoat. So ritual is associated with breaking prohibitions, with transgression, but also with sacrifice, because when you break prohibitions, then you need to channel the aggression somehow. So the scapegoat is nothing else, or our gods are nothing else than dead scapegoats. So when these scapegoats are slaughtered, then suddenly in a magical way there is peace in the community, and basically that peace is attributed to the gods. So gods are nothing else than deified scapegoats. So this is another central idea of Rene Girard. So here's a picture from Bruegel from Flanders from the 16th century. And this nicely illustrates these times of ritual and these times of prohibition. So this painting is called The Fight Between Carnival and Lent. So Carnival, you see that to the left. Lent, you see that to the right. So Carnival is a time of transgression, of intoxication, of undifferentiation in festivities. And Lent is, of course, the time of prohibition, of moderation, and you can see these two in conflict. And that basically says something about our human condition. So humans, they live in two different times. They live in times of ritual. These are times of transgression. They need to be regulated. It's dangerous. It can lead to conflict. It's associated with scapegoating. And then we live in times of prohibition, where desire is limited, where desire is subjected to prohibition in order to avoid escalation into rivalry. So this idea also is you can find that reflected in the ideas of a historian of religion, a writer, philosopher, and a professor at the University of Chicago, whose name was Mircea Eliade, who died in 1986. So he wrote a book, The Sacred and the Profane, and that basically corresponds to ritual, which is the sacred, and the profane, which is the time of prohibition, of course. So he wrote in the foreword to his book, what will concern us is not the relation between the rational and the non-rational elements of religion, but the sacred in its entirety. The first possible definition of the sacred is that it is the opposite of the profane. So again, we have this opposition between two times, the times of prohibition and the times of ritual. But here we bring in Christianity. So Christianity is quite a special religion, Girard would argue. And this is what he wrote about Christianity. Instead of blaming victimization on the victims, the Gospels blame it on the victimizers. What the myths systematically hide, the Bible reveals. So in other words, so in ritual, we put the blame on some scapegoats because we want to unload all the aggression in the tribe onto a scapegoat, and so we need a story to make the tribe believe that the scapegoat is actually guilty, and these stories are nothing else than myths. And so in a myth, the scapegoat is truly guilty, and the scapegoat truly deserves to die. But in Christianity, in the New Testament, so we have a very similar story. We have a scapegoat, namely Jesus Christ. But in this case, the innocence of the scapegoat is revealed, and basically the mob dynamics that are associated with scapegoating are made clear. And so Girard Girard argues that this is that you can post the Dionysian myth versus the Christian gospel. So he also writes, we didn't stop burning witches because we invented science. We invented science because we stopped burning witches. So this is another quite controversial and revolutionary idea of Rene Girard. Myth is associated with lie, because we need to believe, the tribe needs to believe in the absolute guilt of the scapegoat, which is of course just a story. So in order to become to start believing in something like truth, you actually need to reject myth and start seeing that scapegoats are not as guilty as they are thought to be. So now let's move on to Nietzsche. Nietzsche is of course very much fond of the Dionysian, and the Dionysian is nothing else than something that is deeply associated with myth. So let's first see what Nietzsche writes. He writes in The Will to Power, Dionysus versus the crucified, there you have the antithesis. It is not a difference in regard to their martyrdom, it is a difference in the meaning of it. So basically, and Girard points this out, Nietzsche understands very well the difference between myth and the difference between Christianity. So it's exactly the same mechanism, but Christianity reveals some of the mechanism behind the Dionysian myth, while the Dionysian myth actually conceals it. And then Nietzsche writes, I am a disciple to the philosopher Dionysus, and I would rather be a satyr than a saint, which he writes in Ecce Homo. Now, there's a big elephant in Nietzsche's room, because Nietzsche is very much a defender of the Dionysian, but Nietzsche also strongly opposes the mentality of the mob. And there's a big contradiction there. And this is what Rene Girard writes in I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. He writes, Nietzsche opposes, so he believes, the crowd mentality, but he does not recognize his Dionysian stance as the supreme expression of the mob in its most brutal and its most stupid tendencies. So the Dionysian is closely associated with the mob killing a scapegoat, and this is something that Nietzsche does not address. So there is a very clear opposition between Nietzsche and Girard, and that's what I would like to zoom into a bit more in the rest of the talk. So here we have it. So we have Girard in the right corner. So he seems to be on the side of Lent, on the side of prohibition, and then we have Nietzsche here in the left corner, being on the side of ritual. And I would like to kind of take a look at this opposition and see if we can somehow find some unifying viewpoint here. And I think we can find this viewpoint in Buddhism. So in Buddhism, we have different types of Buddhism, and two kind of seemingly opposing types of Buddhism are Sutra and Tantra. So Sutra understands the danger of desire, and Sutra is going to advocate renunciation of desire. So as Tenzin Wangyal writes, so he's a Buddhist teacher, sutric practice is based on renunciation, on getting tired of much of what has been accumulated in space. Practitioners try to throw out the negative, get rid of the self-centeredness that's caused them so much pain, and they try to finish with the greed, anger, and delusion that's kept them in misery for so long, and just keep the love, compassion, faith, equanimity, peace, and wisdom. So this is very much related to prohibition. It is based on renunciation. It's based on setting limits to desire. Now, in contrast to that, we have another type of Buddhism, which is called Tantra, and that is not based on renunciation, but it's based on transformation. And based on transformation of what? It's transformation of desire. So here's another quote from a Buddhist teacher, Lama Thupten Yeshe. So he writes, the basic energy involved in this profound process of tantric transformation is the energy of our own desires. Longchenpa, 14th century Buddhist sage, writes, since confusion is due to afflictive emotions, it is held that freedom comes from making emotions themselves the path. This is like losing one's way, but finding it by turning around and retracing the same path. So you can see that here we have Sutra and we have Tantra. Sutra basically corresponds very much to times of prohibition. Tantra very much corresponds to times of ritual. But of course, here in Buddhism, there is no association of ritual time with scapegoating, which I think is a very important aspect of what's going on here. So here we have the text of Nietzsche again. So we have once you had passions and called them evil, but now you have your virtues. They grew out of your passion. So this is very similar to the tantric idea. I would argue that this is exactly the tantric idea. So you would kind of you could consider Nietzsche as a Western thinker who came very close to a lot of the central ideas that are present in Buddhist Tantra. And now I'd like to bring in another thinker, namely Camille Paglia, who kind of sees art as Western ritual. She writes, "I argue that Judeo-Christianity never did defeat paganism, which still flourishes in art, eroticism, astrology, and pop culture. The immorality, aggression, sadism, voyeurism, and pornography in great art have been ignored or glossed over by most academic critics." So what is going on here? Basically, ritual has, in some sense, degenerated in the West, and it has emerged as art. And that's why we see so many transgressive aspects and aspects that are related to ritual and scapegoating emerging in Western art. So in short, what's the current situation? So I would argue that in the West, we have basically blended the difference, or we have blended two times that are normally very well differentiated in humanity, and that is the difference between ritual time and time of prohibition. So in ordinary time or ritual or time of prohibition, so we have these prohibitions that make sure that that mimetic rivalry doesn't get out of hand. So we have a clear container that keeps desire in check. However, on the other hand, in ritual time, we have transgression of prohibitions, we have intoxication, we have and also scapegoating in order to get rid of aggression that is spreading through the tribe. So what we have now in the West is like one big gray area where there's no real difference between ritual and prohibition anymore. And so we have a lot of unsatisfying rituals and a lot of unsatisfying diffuse prohibitions. So we have intoxication by smoking cigarettes and drinking alcohol. We have clubbing, we have pornography, we have entertainment by watching sports, Netflix binging, and then of course one of the favorite pseudo-ritual pastimes of today, that is scapegoating via digital media. So I would argue that there's this big confusion going on in our current society that doesn't really, and that confusion is due to the lack of distinguishing between times of prohibition and times of ritual. So you could see that Girard is basically a prophet of prohibition. And he's very concerned with the effects of rampant desire and of mimetic desire, escalating into mimetic rivalry and the many dangerous situations that are associated with that. And he's absolutely right. But on the other hand, Nietzsche is very concerned with the stagnation and ossification that is associated with too much prohibition, and he's very much concerned with the transformational aspects of that is associated with ritual time. So basically, what I would argue here is that we see something that is very similar to Sutra, Buddhist Sutra and Buddhist Tantra. We have basically Girard defending a Buddhist something that is akin to Buddhist Sutra, and Nietzsche defending something that is akin to Buddhist Tantra. But they both seem to make the mistake that they think that Girard seems to think that he can live in times of prohibition and deny times of ritual. Nietzsche seems to think that he can live in times of ritual and you can deny times of prohibition. So I would argue that they need to be integrated. And the incompatible aspects of their ideas should, of course, not be denied. I mean, there are strong oppositions between these thinkers, but that's because there are strong oppositions between those two different times. The time of prohibition is very different from the time of ritual, but we seem to need to live in both of these times, and we seem to need to keep these two times very much separated from each other. So this might be one way to understand both Girard and Nietzsche and give them their dues, but also to see a bigger picture that includes them both. So I'm going to end with a couple of quotes from Girard. So this is what Girard writes in 1978. He writes in Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. I do not think that we should mince our words. We must refuse all the scapegoats that Freud and Freudianism have offered to us, the father, the law, and so on. We must refuse the scapegoats that Marx offers, the bourgeoisie, the capitalist, and so on. We must refuse the scapegoats that Nietzsche offers, slave morality, the resentment of others, and so on. All of modernism in its classic stage, with Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud in the forefront, merely offers us scapegoats. But then, in 2007, he writes, I long tried to think of Christianity as in a higher position, but I have had to give up on that. I am now persuaded that we have to think from inside mimeticism. This is basically Girard saying, I long tried to think in terms of prohibition, but now I'm persuaded that we also have to think in terms of ritual, where we are inside mimeticism, where we actually play with dangerous things such as rampant desire, and we use the energy of this rampant desire to cause conversion, to cause transformation. So here we have the prophet of prohibition to the left and the prohibition and the prophet of ritual to the right. And the unity of these two, you could call that maybe the anthropological pragmatism. So maybe we are moving into an era of anthropological pragmatism where we understand the need for prohibition, we understand the need for ritual, and we also understand that they need to be separated from each other. And that means that there will be different spaces, there will be different containers, different let's say different communities that will have different rules at different times. So that was it. So I'd like to thank some people. So a lot of these ideas were developed in discussions with Andrew Sweeney and Alexander Barth in the Sweeney versus Barth series. They're all online. A lot of these things were also explored in the also Sprach Zarathustra conference that was organized by Cadell Last. I learned a lot from Tantra, both Buddhist Tantra and less traditional Tantra, from Alexa Bartman and Keith Towman. And finally, we have an ongoing project with we are reading Girard's magnum opus. I'm doing that together with Owen Cox and Daniel Fraga as part of the technosocial Girard sessions. And so we're going to do the third session soon and put it online. So if you want to hear more about that, then you can turn to these sessions. So we're going through that book chapter by chapter and discussing it. Okay, I think that's it for me.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Wonderful as usual. What I propose now is perhaps that me and Owen can riff with you a little bit and ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the larger group for Q&A. Does that sound good, Owen?
Yep, sounds good to me.
Yeah. I have one question I want to start us off with. I was at a funeral today at Père Lachaise, and it was in a very religious context, but it was entirely secular. Like, it was in this beautiful old incredible mausoleum with stars in the wall, and yet it was they were singing Marxist songs, and it was kind of strange in that way. And I thought, like, okay, what do we need to do here to fix this? Do we need to bring back old rituals of Christianity? Do we need to invent new rituals? And since we mostly fail at that, and there's a hubris in trying to invent religion, on the other hand, the old style of religion is dead. And so, how do you see like how are you in terms of like tradition and like bringing back tradition or throwing tradition away or morphing tradition, or how do we bring back this kind of ritual time?
Well, I think that traditional religions, they've been very good at installing prohibitions. So I think they actually have a great future.
Yeah, but are they? Can you mix them with the ritual part of it, like that we were talking about, the transgressive part of it? And do they already have that included in it? Like there is a transgressive aspect to Christian, for example, drinking the blood of Christ and eating the body of Christ. It's a very transgressive at its heart. It's transgressive, but you wouldn't call it tantric or something like that, where people were like, is the tantric ritual included in that, or is it, I don't know. How do you see all that?
But I think that Christianity has always been very they've kind of been hush hush about it. The West has always had art, and that has always been very transgressive, but it's always been a bit outside of Christianity, right? So yes. The thing is that you don't need to bring everything into these. The problem is that people always want to have one system that encompasses everything. And basically what I kind of argued here is that you cannot do that. That's not possible. You need to have some kind of religion or some kind of guidance that is there for times of prohibition, and you need to have a very different system that is present in times of ritual. So trying to unite these, even if you look at Buddhism, like, okay, there's sutric Buddhism, there's tantric Buddhism, but there is a tension there. And that tension is inherent. You should not resolve that tension. And in Christianity, I think in the Christian world, we had the tension between, let's say, traditional Christianity, and then we've always had art. We have an enormous amount of transgressive art, right? And it's a big part of our Christian societies. So in that sense, that's what I mean with this era of anthropological pragmatism, right? So there's a lot of people who are now experimenting with these ideas, right? So you need both prohibition, because you can't. Nietzsche thinks that you can just the overman, right? It's like the what is it, the revaluation of all values, and there's some kind of romantic idea in Nietzsche that you can just investigate your own personal authentic desire or your authentic values, and you can go beyond tradition. And there's kind of like a fantasy that you can always live in ritual time, which is very common now in the West, and that will not work. So you need this tension between transgressive time, between ritual time, where times of transformation, and then times where there are clear prohibitions in place that help you, that make sure that you don't go off the deep end.
Just one last follow-up there. Do you think that in the future that a Christian tantrism could exist, or can that only exist in the Hindu traditions and the Buddhist traditions, or outside of traditions? Or
well, Christianity doesn't really seem to have this traditionally. It seems to be that there will be a tension between the spaces that are ritual spaces and spaces of prohibition that are more typical for Christianity. I don't know whether you want to put it that explicitly.
Okay, got you.
I think that there should be tension. There should be some kind of tension between prohibition and ritual. There's tension between Sutra and Tantra. But you can't do one without the other.
But there seems to be a difference between, let's say, in the Buddhist tradition, you have Sutric Buddhism and you have Tantric Buddhism, and in Christianity, you have Christianity, and then you have kind of like this paganism, right? Which isn't exactly Tantrism, right? It's not exactly Tantric because it's not as sophisticated as Tantric. It can be very sophisticated, but it's not exactly the same thing. I guess that's another tension.
Yeah, but it's called art, right? I mean, you have all these masterpieces of Christian art, which are obviously, dealing with topics that go way beyond the prohibition of Christianity, right? So you have many artworks that use let's say. What is it again? The ecstasy of Saint Teresa is something like that.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly what it is, but this is a very famous example where you have the depiction of a Christian saint, but it's very obviously something else is going on with the ecstasy of that woman, right? So and that's just plain in your face, right? So so that is a good example of this tension that Christianity has always had with art. I would kind of say like you have like Buddhist sutra, and you have when you have Buddhist tantra. In Christianity, you just have mainstream Christianity, and you have art. That's what Paglia points out, right? So Paglia said, like, art has always been full of sadism and voyeurism and transgression, and it has not been. She poses that it has been ignored largely, and I agree with that.
Yeah,
Christianity has always had something that corresponds to Tantra, because it's always had art.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's just not explicit. It's not codified. There's not a tantric path, like there are in the Eastern traditions.
But the problem is, if you try to sanitize everything, then it becomes not transgressive.
I agree. Yeah, and also often the tantric
twist.
paths in Buddhism are very sutric. They just have tantric kind of like they have tantric iconography, but they're actually very sutric, and then some of the sutric, like the Zen masters, were very tantric. So it's not as clear cut a story as perhaps
it cannot be a clear cut story, because then if you try to include everything, then if you say, well, now this is all permitted, well, then you can't be transgressive anymore. So every rule that you put in the time of prohibition, right? Every rule that's there will be interesting material to break in ritual space.
Yeah,
that is the tension that will never be relieved. Apparently, what I seem to I think that after reading a lot of Girard, and I seem to have come to the conclusion that there is this inherent tension in humans. They live in two different times, and you need different rule sets for these different times. And that doesn't mean that ritual is just doing anything, right? So as Bataille points out, that these transgressive spaces, these spaces of ritual, are actually also full of rules. They're just different than the rules from prohibition.
Yes, absolutely. I mean,
there's no freedom for humans.
Well,
even I would go even further than that and say that,
like, we kind of reach a point where right now there's a loss of faith in any kind of authority who might set rules, both in the normal time and the ritual time. Like, people don't really want to have a boss. They want to pretend that work is not really a hierarchy. Everyone's friendly.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they want to go, and it's like, you pretend that sex doesn't exist until you're 16, and then it's everybody go and do it.
But there's also a strong call for more prohibition. I think that you can, something like Me Too, you can caricature it as scapegoating, and that's definitely going on as well. But I think that it's also a strong call for bringing back prohibition. In the 60s, there was a complete breakdown of rules and regulations. The structure of prohibition broke down, and I think there's a strong movement now to bring it back, or to bring back some prohibition, but people aren't really clear what they're doing. So there's one big confusion between ritual time and time of prohibition. It's like one big gray area where people don't really know in which time they are.
Prohibit anybody who tells anybody else that they can't live in ritual time all the time.
Wait, my brain just melted.
No, you can't live in ritual time all the time, right? You can't live unless you're like join the circus or something. It's like, like you have to have most
people are desperate. We live in times of unsatisfying ritual. Like the beers in the evening, the Netflix binging, the going to watch football, Pornhub. These are unsatisfying rituals.
Yes.
That is nothing like a real ritual. A real ritual is completely different. So people are constantly looking for this real deep ritual, and they end up with something that is ersatz. So this is something that will be. That's why so many people are looking for communities that can bring about real ritual. That's, for example, what's going on with things like Burning Man and Borderland. These are attempts to bring back deeper rituals. And Me Too is an attempt to bring back real prohibition, which is needed. You need both. So this is one big exploration. But now that we have Girard and a lot of thinkers who are using Girard, like Zizek, for example, he doesn't talk about it, but he uses a lot of Girard, as far as I can tell. So all of this stuff is now in the open. We know how desire works. We know that desire is mimetic. We know that people go from mimetic desire to mimetic rivalry, and from mimetic rivalry to scapegoating. We know all of that. We know the difference between profane time, times of prohibition, and ritual time, times of transgression and transformation. We understand all of that. So now people are engineering their environment so that they can live in these two times in a constructive way. I think that's something that our good friend Daniel Fraga is exploring with his ontological design. We are designing, people are starting to design containers around them where they can live in times of prohibition and in times of ritual. And in both cases, they want to have clear containers that make this tension manageable and transformative and functional.
Well, what's the difference between, let's say, mature ritual and like adolescent ritual, like heavy metal music or something like that? It's like has a tantric, transgressive feel to it, or just like there seems to be a lot of that in the culture, but mature transgressive ritual seems to be more rare, as far as I can see.
Yeah, it's extremely sought after, and people who know how to do this, they will become more, and they're already important. They will become more and more important. It's also something that is very different to automate. It's one thing that are the digital, the machine learning algorithms and the AI algorithms will not manage to do. They will not manage to bring about rituals. You will need humans to do that.
Good point. Yeah, I think what this funeral I was at today, I really felt the lack of profound ritual in a space that once had very profound ritual. Like the space was power. You go to Paris and they have these powerful ritual spaces, and then there's this secular thing going on in it that is completely lacking in any energy or something like that. So yes, I think that's right.
I recently read something in the Economist about Pope Francis. He was confronted with German Catholics, and they wanted more. They wanted more diversity and attention for homosexual marriage and all of that stuff, and priests that should get married, and then Francis said, well, yeah, but we already have German Protestantism.
Oh, you're right.
I found that very funny, right? It's kind of like, well, the appealing thing of many religions is exactly because they set these boundaries. Yeah, it's like they have these prohibitions, but then again, that's your time of prohibition. Then those rules might be working for you there, but I think the point that I wanted to make is that you could see this request by the German Catholics, right? You could kind of see this as kind of expanding times of prohibition so that they start overlapping with times of ritual.
Mm-hmm. There's sort of a tendency in the Protestant thing to destroy the ritual, right? To make it as put it in far in the background as possible. And I think that's the big mistake of Protestantism. I think the elaboration of ritual is what's interesting in religion, and people want to throw that out. And anyway,
it's the more it becomes inclusive, so to say, the more it becomes diluted, because it includes so much that there's no more tension anymore between prohibition and ritual. You need that tension. Mm-hmm. And I think that once you start understanding that, then you see that all these attempts to kind of include everything in one big system, these attempts will fail. That's kind of the point that I wanted to make with the story about Pope Francis. So that there is this tendency to kind of make the systems bigger and bigger, so they include everything, and then there are also these there might be reasons not to do that, because then you lose the tension between prohibition and ritual.
It's an interesting way read, right, the liberation movement, like the women's liberation or the movement for gay marriage, is trying to include more of what has been excluded in prohibition time. But then by virtue of being there, it's then not in the ritual time.
I mean, there's nothing cooler than breaking the rules, right?
Yeah, but
I mean,
but now everybody breaks the rules, and they're not even cool. That's not cool anymore because all the prohibitions have been broken. So they're not. It's no longer cool to be like that. It's become the status quo, right? To break the prohibition.
I don't think it's going away, right? So that's the interesting thing. Like, I don't think women or gay people getting married is gonna go back in the box anytime soon.
No, that's good, because you don't want to have some kind of powerful, religion that is capable of putting their rules on people, right? That's we tried that in the past. Nobody wants to go back to that, right? But there's no, I mean, people are making their own communities with their own prohibitions.
Yeah, that's the point of the ontological design, right? It's like kind of really going back, going from the ground up. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, what's going to stop a bunch of people to just come together and saying, like, well, in our community, these are our prohibitions?
Yeah, but my worry about that is, like, what kind of communities are going to, what kind of cults are going to arise?
No, well, we're going to have an enormous amount of, different community. I mean, and there will be, I think there will be a space, there will be a common space of prohibition. That's already here, right? There's a space where we know, let's not say this in public because it's dangerous. Let's not act like this because it can be misunderstood. So I think we will have a global space of prohibition.
We already sort of have, right?
We will have a lot of smaller communities that are isolated from that are doing their own thing. Not so much in secrecy. It's just more like, there will be, it's like a club, right? This club plays a certain amount of music, certain amount of crowd is attracted to that, and they're doing their thing. Some people go to the club that plays folk music, other people go to the club that plays electronic music. It will be like that. It's the great splintering.
Mm-hmm. That's as well. It's almost like the digital prohibition. Like, we all hang out on Zoom. Oh, I'm frozen. Am I back? Yeah, I was saying that we all hang out over Zoom, and there's only so much that can be done. So it's inevitably a time of almost intense prohibition. And then the moment we get together in physical space, it's like, party time. So that's the kind of funny thing. Don't give it away, Owen. No parties happen.
That's a cool point. I like that. It's like, this is sort of like Sutra, right? It's like super dry. We're not even like touching or drinking or, but then when we get together, it's like a big Mardi Gras or something, because we need these explosions of. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's how lots of the digital tribes I seem to come into contact with work. It's like it's kind of formal and professional on Zoom because it has to be. It's literally talking heads. And then people see each other, and it's
but there's also something that I didn't talk about, but it's in my article that I wrote for the Zarathustra book that Cadell is organizing, and that is that there are writers that write, or philosophers or thinkers or whatever you want to call them, right? That are in ritual time. Nietzsche is a good example. Nietzsche is in ritual time. That's how he writes. Other examples are Machiavelli, de Sade, Bataille, Blake, Burroughs. All of these writers, they are in ritual time. They are describing ritual time. And then you have a lot of writers who are more in times of prohibition. Paglia, Girard. So they are kind of like and they're often looking at ritual time from the time of prohibition.
Oh, that's so interesting.
All of these outrageous writers, they are basically people who are very concerned with the disappearance of the ritual and the disappearance of transformation. Because how do you actually cause this? What is transformation? That's actually something that maybe we should discuss a bit. Transformation is nothing else, understanding that desire doesn't work. Desire doesn't work. It's a very dangerous thing, and if you believe that you will get what you desire, then you are deluded. But the only way in which you can find it out is sometimes to go really deep into desire, so you see it doesn't work, and to basically hit against the wall. You need to do that to some extent. Otherwise, you get it all from a book, right? A book full of prohibitions, and that can turn you into an automaton.
Well, I was also thinking of it as the difference between aesthetic states, right? Like those writers we're talking about often write in alternate states or ecstatic states or kind of in metaphor and in a very whereas the other kind of writers you're speaking are writing in a detached, objective, sober state of mind, right? And so the ritual state is intoxicated, and ecstatic and poetic, mythopoetic and poetic, and whereas the other state is more prosaic and ordinary and just about clarity and about seeing things objectively. And so that's a very interesting point between, let's say, prose and poetry, the prosaic and the poetic, which is the same kind of difference that you're speaking of.
Yeah, and you need that tension, right? But the problem occurs when you start reading people who are really clearly writing from ritual time, like Nietzsche. I mean, like Heidegger did a very systematic reading of Nietzsche. I mean, that's an abomination. Nietzsche is a crazy person. This is a crazy person, right? I mean, if you think that you can live like, Nietzsche is Overman and stuff like that, this guy made himself insane by just jumping into ritual space without understanding what he was doing, and he documented everything. I mean, Nietzsche is interesting because he's somebody who shows what happens when you really dive deep into ritual space. Then you destroy yourself. That's Nietzsche. And that Nietzsche
that's
is the
Dionysian
basis
too,
of much of 20th century philosophy. That's a bit mind-boggling. I mean, Nietzsche's thinking led to the Nazis were totally in the wake of Nietzsche, right? I mean, denying the link between Nietzsche and Nazism, that is just ridiculous. I mean, Nietzsche was somebody who said, like, the Dionysian, I need it, I embrace it, and I'll pay any price for it, right?
He also said the Germans are fucking idiots and they will misunderstand everything I write.
Yeah, but Nietzsche would always say that people misunderstood him, right? That's what he would say to everything. I mean, look at his relationship to Wagner. He was like really going deep into mimetic rivalry, mimetic desire with intoxication, and he didn't. That's why Nietzsche kind of is not completely the same as Buddhist Tantra, right? Because he never really understood the nature of desire. He never really understood the danger of desire. He really thought that, we need to be authentic and we need to look for our own personal desires. And if you do that, then you basically become a victim of mimetic desire. You'll start competing with everybody around you, and that's what Nietzsche did with Wagner.
I think this is
understand what desire was. He didn't get
Nietzsche's
that
like the first accelerationist. He just wanted to put his foot on the gas and go.
Yeah. That's one way to see it. Yeah. He was intoxicated by the death of God. Oh, look, prohibition is gone. Now we're rid of that. What? And that's the big pipe dream that people have, that removing prohibition will liberate desire, and that's not how it works.
Yeah, but to his point, he kind of knew that was an abyss. He wasn't going into it completely blind, in a naive sort of way. He said nothing can wipe the blood off our hands when you kill God, right? He kind of knew what a dark place that he was in, and articulated that.
Yeah,
he wasn't really celebrating, fascism. He was...
No, nothing like that. Nothing as outspoken like that. But it's what Owen said, right? Nietzsche is a message from hell.
Yeah, I agree with that.
That's it, and that's how you should read Nietzsche. This is a message from hell. And I mean, if you read the Antichrist, I mean, this is very just the vibe of that book, like this hatred against Christianity. This is a very, if somebody who has a deep hatred for Christianity, right, this complete rejection of the concern for the victim, which Nietzsche had, right? This complete rejection of the concern for the scapegoat. That is a very worrying sign.
Yeah, it's like you would say, it's like without the compassion and the wisdom of Sutra, which is all about compassion and wisdom. It's like, fuck compassion and wisdom here.
Yes.
That's kind of Nietzsche, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's
the way I read it, I think he's kind of necessary for his time. Like, in a sense, it's Nietzsche who calls bullshit on the bourgeois Enlightenment paradigm and is like, you guys aren't wearing any clothes.
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
like,
nobody would argue about that.
Yeah, he's like, you have not thought through the depths of human nature very well at all. And he's kind of screaming it in the most loud, abrasive, crazy wisdom way possible. But
yeah,
then
Nietzsche's
somebody,
he just writes it up, right? And there's so many nuggets of psychological brilliance in Nietzsche. He's incredibly smart person. But I mean, there's especially the link between the Dionysian and the mob. He doesn't see that at all. That means that it's so flawed. It's so flawed. And I never hear people talking about that. I mean, people seem to kind of think, oh, Nietzsche, that's the big deal. I mean, seriously?
Well, I think it's like your wife or your girlfriend, you know, she's very flawed. You still love her, but you know she's really flawed.
The dangerous territory there, Andrew.
What?
Dangerous territory there, Andrew. Prohibition.
I'm not talking about my wife.
Oh,
not being personal here. Okay, everybody's wife, you know, is fucking flawed. But anyway, oh, it's not. So it's 9 o'clock. Maybe we should open it up to the group now.
There's actually a question in chat, so maybe okay. There was somebody who says that Teresa of Avillon. Yeah, that might be.
Maybe Jury wants to answer his question. Ask his question.
Oh, yeah.
All right. This was like somewhat addressed in what you said earlier, but like when you speak of like times of prohibition versus times of ritual, do you like on a societal level, do you like separate them clearly and like, okay, now this part of society is in prohibition and then it lasts for some time and now it's in ritual, or is it like, you know, like different groups engage in different times and like you were speaking of like containers and then like there's container for this group of people to go to and this group. So like, how do you see, you know, this distribution and the distribution over time of this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's actually a third vehicle in Buddhism that's called Dzogchen. And so this is a nice, neat little story, right? So you have times of prohibition, you have times of ritual, but in practice, you seem to kind of move in and out of these times at the drop of a hat. So you actually cycle through these times. So there is this blurring between these two times. So sometimes you're in a time of prohibition, but then suddenly that time of prohibition kind of adopts the aspect of a ritual. And so what Dzogchen one of the things that Dzogchen, I think, accomplishes is to kind of release that strong or to relax that strong opposition between these two different times. So that's one answer. I would argue that there are many. You could argue that some societies will spend very much a lot of time in prohibition. So it can happen on the societal level. It can happen on the level of time of a group. It can happen on a personal level. I think that this is a very interesting or a very useful distinction that you can apply at many different levels. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, like that makes sense. It's like a very generalizable distinction which we can apply in many situations and like find different ways to architect it in society.
Yes.
So Egil, you also had something in the chat there, so maybe you want to go ahead.
No, that was concerning the statue of the female saint who was experienced ecstasy. I think that's the name of her. It wasn't a question as such.
Yeah,
it's clarifying.
Teresa of Avillon, the Catholic saint.
Yeah, it's isn't it? What is it, Bernini or something like that? I'll see if I can find it. You find the next question.
She lived entirely in ritual time. She was in total states of mad ecstasy. It's very interesting to read her work from a mystical point of view.
Is the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa by Bernini. And that's very much, this is a very good example of it's a Christian image, but it's clearly a woman in orgasmic ecstasy. So, and I think this is a very good illustration of this interesting opposition between like traditional Christianity on the one hand and then art on the other hand. And I think that's basically how Christianity dealt with prohibition and ritual. We call it art or carnival. Catholic countries, they do carnival, right? Italy, Belgium, Flanders. So carnival is like one. I never understood what this was when I was a kid. I mean, there didn't seem to be anything really concrete that people were celebrating. They just went crazy for 3 days, right? And then they drank and they were dancing and very, very ordinary, well-respected citizens. They just went completely crazy during carnival. And now it makes perfect sense. I mean, that is just, and that the carnivals, the people involved in carnival, they went to the Gothic church in my hometown. They went to the Gothic 14th century church to be blessed by the priest, right? So there you can clearly see that even in Christianity there's this tension between prohibition and there's ritual. But in carnival you can do crazy things, but there were clear boundaries, right? I mean, you have to misbehave in the right way.
Yeah, and if you don't do that, the entire society becomes a carnival, right? Because if you don't have that outlet for carnival, then the entire society becomes sort of degenerate in carnival all the time, right?
Yeah, so either you completely ossify, so everything grinds to a halt, or the pressure cooker explodes, right? I think that's basically what can happen.
Yeah. Okay, I think Madalena was next.
Well, Thomas, I want to thank you because your recommendation, I think it was in the Techno-Social podcast series, but I'm not sure, of a book, Vengeance in Reverse, the Tangle Loops of Violence, Myth, and Madness. Speaking of pragmatic anthropology, was extremely prescient for me in a moment where I was trying to navigate, let's say, the situation where a very important person in my life had strayed off into this sort of alcoholic spiral. And I had learned a tremendous amount from his descent, if you will. And I felt privileged in being that intimate witness, so I couldn't fall into sort of the scapegoating game because of how much I had learned in that process. And specifically in his book, he talks about Diomedes and Glaucus, which are sort of a secondary characters in the Iliad, where these two enemies meet. And the proposal is the exchange of armor. And that gave me a tremendous amount of food for thought. How can you exchange the armor in a situation where basically it seems like the only option is to, kill or be killed kind of thing. And these two heroes who are on opposite sides of the struggle, just because of one question, who are you and where do you come from, ascertain that they're grandparents knew each other and were friends. And somehow in that recognition, there's a proposition of like, well, I don't want to kill you and I don't want to die because then I won't be able to host you.
So I'm getting a bit lost. Is there a question in there or?
Well, my question to you is, would it be at all reasonable to say that the transformation from mimetic rivalry can be that of mutual admiration?
Yes. Yes, that's that story that you refer to is yeah. So that the key point of that book, or one of the key points of that book, is that you can not only have mimetic rivalry, where you basically have people copying each other's aggression, right? So, oh, he shouted at me, so I'm going to shout back at him, and a bit more even. But what that book points out is that you can have the opposite, and that means that you can do nice things to people. So somebody does something to you that you enjoy, and then you immediately notice it, and you copy that gesture. So that is basically, as the title of the book says, right? It's what was it called again? The book, it's
Revenge in Reverse.
Revenge in Reverse, right? So it's the opposite. So in a good marriage, that is what happens, right? So there are always these bits, like to have interaction, and people who notice these bits and react to it, they have a good marriage. And people who ignore these bits, they end up divorced. So you come home and you ask your husband, so how was your day, honey? And then the answer is, oh, can't you see I'm busy? That is not taking these gifts, and that is suddenly turning your partner into a rival, and that is exactly what that book is about. And so, yeah, that is a good question, and I think that's my answer.
And I'm curious also, why do you think maybe Girard didn't refer to, I think, one of his or one of the sources, which is Spinoza, who does talk about imitatio, in those terms, and yet he never recognizes that source as a potential, because he talks about emendatio, which is not necessarily correction. It's this notion that, you make mistakes as you're a scribe and you're copying text, and then you have to sort of write over it. But it's obvious that there was something that was written over. So you don't erase that. Fault is in some ways shared. I mean, what I'm aiming towards is perhaps this notion of shared failure, so that you don't obey the metaphysics of separability, which individualism has, as a teleology, sort of exacerbated the mimetic mechanism in a way. I don't know if I'm muddling this too much, but for me, it's very present, this notion of shared failure, that if you don't ascribe the blame and you say that you are always entangled with whatever is going on, as opposed to looking for the other to blame or whatever, that you are a part
Madalena,
of this.
I'm going to cut you off so we can go to Alistair's question, because we need more time. Alistair.
Sure.
Thomas, thank you very much for this interesting spin on things. I have two interrelated questions. First, you speak to the conflation of the times of the prohibition and the ritual together as a crisis of sorts. What do you see that crisis resulting in if it maintains the conflation? And then second part of the question is, in order to disentangle these things in an appropriate and relevant manner, where do we go to identify the parts and processes of each thing and how do we create the appropriate tension or distance from one another, or bring them together in your understanding so far?
So your first question is, what is the effect of the let's say the disappearance of the boundaries between ritual and ritual time and time of prohibition, right? Well, basically, ritual time is associated with intoxication. It's associated with rivalry and violence, with breaking of a lot of letting go of identities, which can be very confusing. So that's what we see in society very much, I would say. I mean, look at the enormous problems with addiction that are going on, for example, in the States with fentanyl and stuff like that. That's a good example. So I think problems with intoxication is basically people who are trying to live in ritual time. That's one example. Confusion of identity, no more fixed identities, no more no more clear, well-defined identity. Loss of identity and non-differentiation, that is something that belongs to ritual time. So basically not knowing who you are, which is very confusing if you have to kind of be functional in times of prohibition. So yeah, I mean, intoxication, confusion, violence, rivalry, competition between parents and children. That's a big one in our society. So we compete with our parents, for example. That normally that should be very well regulated. All of these things are symptoms of confusion between prohibition and ritual. So that is rampant now. It's like everywhere. What can we do? Well, you can find a system of prohibitions and rituals that work for you. You can look at different religions or even systems of a-religious systems that give you some kind of framework. Many people are doing that, right? I mean, they go to they do Wim Hof, for example. I mean, there's a certain practice that you do. There's certain things that you you adhere to, and that gives you structure. That's a good source of prohibition. Other people will turn to traditional religions like Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism. I don't think that these religions are dead at all. I think that they actually will become much more important in the future when people start seeing what they are, why they are there.
Thank you.
Hugo?
Yes. So apart from Girard and Nietzsche, are there other thinkers that you consider as important to study today? And who are those thinkers in that case? Thank you.
Well, I like Paglia a lot, so she's a bit. So read. I mean, so read Girard, and then you can read. I like Lacan, but don't start reading Lacan before you read Nietzsche, before you read Girard, because then it will not make any sense. Lacan is actually really interesting because you can see what he's doing. Lacan is very humorous. Lacan is kind of a joker, right? And if you first read Girard, then you read Lacan, you'll have a very good time. It depends a bit what you want to explore. If you want to explore the ritual time from within, then you can read Bataille, you can read Machiavelli, you can read Casanova. Very interesting. Nietzsche, of course. What one of the philosophers that I spend a lot of time with is Alfred North Whitehead. So there we are in a very different environment. That's a very somebody who thinks about some kind of metaphysics, essentially, how our world is structured. So if you really want to dive deep into philosophy, then Alfred North Whitehead is very interesting. He also has
Okay,
very
thank you.
interesting ideas about religion. He wrote a book called what's it called again? It's a very tiny book. So he's written some really deep metaphysics stuff like process and reality. But he's also written books about the evolution of science, evolution of thought, about the structure of religion, and that's a very interesting thinker as well. If you want to have a good laugh, then you read Heidegger or Nietzsche. That's just fun.
Thank you very much.
Go on, Egil. Go on again.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I had loads of questions, but I think I'll take one that is a bit more concrete. So from the theory of mimetic, rivalry, and so on, what kind of predictions, what kind of model would you get for an internet community such as this one, this study room? And then what kind of predictions for potential problems and so on would you make for this kind of community? If you try to go a bit meta, I suppose, or out of Philatio, perhaps.
So I'm not sure I got it, but so you're asking what kind of dangers related to mimetic desire could arise in communities such as these. Is that correct?
Yes, that's more specific, but also in general, how it would work, I suppose, if it gets a bit more mushed into this kind of setting.
Well, I think that the first thing you can do is just understand how desire works, and so it's a very simple idea, right? So, okay, you admire somebody. If you admire somebody, you think, oh, well, that person is a big deal. So then you start going to want the same thing as that person. So, and then you're going to compete with that person. So that means that the people that are your enemies, they are typically the people that you really liked. So once you know that, it's kind of like a bit mind-boggling, right? And then you also understand that if you are, suppose that that you get really enthusiastic about Girard, right? Then you're going to compete with me because I get a lot of attention by, making talks about Girard. Then you're going to do the same thing. You're going to be really annoying because, I mean, that's my thing. So you should be aware of all these things and suddenly see like this desire is a really, really nasty thing. And what Girard says, like, what do you do with people who put you into situations of mimetic rivalry? Well, you just walk away. You put people at the right distance. So basically one of the practices in times of prohibition is like, don't put people into double binds, right? Don't tell people, if you do this, it's a problem. If you don't do it, it's also a problem, right? So I could tell, if you don't follow my obsession with Girard, then, oh, you're wrong, right? But if you do follow it, then you're, oh, why are you doing the same thing as me, right? So that's a double bind. So you can't win. You're an asshole if you do it. You're an asshole if you don't do it. So you should be aware of that and not put people in that position. But you should also not allow people to put you in that position. You should recognize when people are putting you in double binds, and then you shouldn't shout at them. You can just walk away. Just don't interact with them anymore. But if you want to be tantric, then you just go full on into it. And then you say, oh, great, rivalry. Why don't we just completely play this out and actually, throw some oil on the fire and see where it gets us. You typically do not do this at work or in your marriage, unless you know what you're doing. But this could be, I mean, that's a tantric idea, right? Rather than shrinking and then shrieking away from it, you actually start using that energy and do something interesting with it. Creating rivalry with if you like let's say a kung fu master who wants to really provoke a pupil, so to get the best out of him, could play around with mimetic desire in a very conscious way. He could create rivalry, well knowing that at the right point the rivalry would dissolve, and he would just have a pupil who learned what he needed to learn, right? So especially sports competition and stuff like that, there you need to have some kind of going into this dangerous area of mimetic desire, because you need that intensity and you need that energy to obtain the learning goals.
Don't you always need that though, Thomas? Like in a sense, like if you have people who, you always need models, right? You always have to have somebody who's greater than you, so that you can transcend yourself. I guess the danger is if that person is too close to you. That's what you're saying. Yeah,
so the distance is important. So you need to keep people at the right distance. People who are very who have a tendency for mimetic rivalry, you should keep them at a safe distance. Or if you yourself are a person who has those tendencies, then you should be aware that you have to distance yourself from others to protect them.
To protect them, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, what I noticed today is that people often, the model thing is kind of unconscious. Like with my students, you ask them if they have heroes or something, or if they idolize anybody, or if they put anybody on a pedestal, and they say, no, I don't idolize anybody. I don't have any models. You know, I just idolize myself, or I don't just, but nobody really does that. Like that's an unconscious thing that people think they're doing, but then they get into trouble later because they don't have conscious models. So you need religion. You need religion to have conscious models. That's why you worship, things.
Yeah, if you don't know who your models, if you think you have no models, then you probably are turning people around you into gods. That's what Nietzsche did. So if you don't have any models, transcendental models that are far away from you, right? Let's say that you take Einstein as a model. That's great. Einstein is dead. You're not gonna go into competition with Einstein, right? But if you take your the professor in your lab as a model, that's much more dangerous, because you can go into competition with that person and into rivalry. So you need to know who your models are. Pick your models wisely. That's the only thing you can do, basically. I think the rest is just, you can't do much more than picking our models and being aware of people who become models. If you don't have models, if you don't have any transcendental models, which typically come from religion, and typically you turn humans into gods. That's what happening big time on Facebook, right? We watch all these updates. So that person is in Italy again, in the sun, and I'm here in Denmark, and it's cold. It's very cold, and so you turn humans into gods if you don't have transcendental models. That's the big symptom of Nietzsche, right? He turned Wagner into a god, and he hated him, of course.
Yeah, it's a simultaneous love-hate relationship.
Yeah, that's what God is. So God is something tremendous and horrible at the same time. That's what God is.
Very good. So we have a couple more minutes. That's a good kind of like note in a way to leave on. Maybe if somebody has one more question, and then we can go into the Wonder Room and have some drinks and go into ritual time.
Hugo's got his hand up again.
Hugo, do you have another question, Hugo?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
So I have a question for Thomas regarding scapegoats. What are are there any common characteristics when choosing a scapegoat? I know they vary from culture to culture. Like in the West, it would probably traditionally be the Jews, who would be a very common scapegoat. We see that everywhere. But in other cultures, they are someone else, another group of people. So is there like a common characteristic when a society charges their energy onto a scapegoat?
Good question. And there is an obvious answer. You scapegoat and kill somebody who will not be able to be revenged. So what would that be? That would be some kind of orphan that has no family. That would be a woman that doesn't have any family and that doesn't seem to be very strong, right? I mean, you're not going to scapegoat a very strong warrior with a big family, right? That's dangerous. I mean, you kill that guy and then you have your whole family, his whole family on your back, right? That's not good. So you want to scapegoat somebody who's weak, right? And so mobs are cowards. So if you're ever scapegoated by a mob, you should not show weakness, because then they just get more angry, because then they know they can really go in for the kill, right? So that's one thing to do. The second thing to do is you should, that's what Jesus did when he was confronted with this mob that wanted to stone the adulteress. So he who is without sin, throw the first stone. But that breaks the symmetry of the mob. So then suddenly somebody needs to step up out of the mob, throw the first stone, and that means that there's a mob and you. That's very dangerous. You don't want, the mob wants to be on different. So people in mobs are either completely overtaken by on differentiation, basically by mania, or they are cowards because they hide in the mob, right? So and in what is happening now in the West, so the Christianity, which is now a global phenomenon, Christianity is everywhere. Atheists call themselves atheists, but you know they basically are Christians without knowing it, because one of the big things that the big moral absolute that now exists, that is, we cannot scapegoat. We cannot kill the scapegoat anymore. So that's just not allowed anymore. That's why everybody's so obsessed with minorities and protecting people and stuff like that. That's Christianity. Christianity is obsessed with protecting the scapegoat, and rightfully so, because it's a very deep mechanism that is associated with violence and with ignorance, with stupidity. So Christianity is quite right about it. But if you want to make a scapegoat, what are you going to use as a story? That's a question to you, Hugo. Suppose that you want to make a scapegoat. Who are you going to scapegoat
now? Someone who a lot of people are envious of, probably, and easy to, and are in a minority, probably.
You're going to scapegoat somebody who scapegoats. Because scapegoating is the moral absolute. You're not allowed to scapegoat. You're going to find somebody who scapegoated somebody else. And then you're going to scapegoat that person. And you're going to get away with it because you say, well, yeah, I'm scapegoating that person, but he deserves it because he's scapegoating. So you're using the religious, the kind of like this religion. No, it's not really an anthropological revelation, right, of the scapegoating. You're going to use that to scapegoat in a very nasty and hidden way. That's currently what is going on big time in the West.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because that's sort of where the blame starts to shift from the victim to onwards to the perpetrator, and that comes, I guess, from Christianity. I don't know, but I guess it makes sense.
Yeah, so that's and then of course it's again a delusion, right? Because these people that are, you can see that in these people who are guilty, they're not just guilty of something. It's not that they did something wrong, right? They're like absolute evil. You know, like they're really, really evil person. You know, like what is it? You got Weinstein, absolute evil. Oh, he's a Jew. And then you got Epstein, that's also absolute evil, right? Oh, that's also a Jew. Interesting.
Yeah, it's just a coincidence, right?
It's kind of interesting, right? I mean,
I mean, it is. Yeah,
it's very interesting. So these people who are, and I'm not saying they're innocent. No, I don't think they're innocent. They seem to be pretty guilty. But this whole attitude of absolute guilt, right? This is what Christianity very much warns against. And if you indulge in this, right, in this absolute guilt idea, and you rejoice in the mob that moves in on these people who are absolute guilty, then you're not a Christian. Then you're just a pagan using some a Christian excuse to indulge in your bloodthirsty archaic nature.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think Alexander Bard said something about that, where he said that when people who call themselves Christians try to scapegoat, you should use Christianity against them and tell them, no, that this is exactly when you're not Christian. This is when you're a pagan. You're not being Christian right now.
Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, seriously, Christians burning witches. I mean, the New Testament is the story of this innocent person who was kind of persecuted by a bloodthirsty mob, right? And that mob consisted of the Romans and the Jews, and they hated each other, right? They united against the scapegoat. So it's the revelation of the scapegoating mechanism. how that ever could be used to justify, you know, persecuting Jews or burning witches, that's kind of like mind-boggling, isn't it? It's like the story, it's like the absolute revelation of this nasty mechanism, and saying, like, you know, if you want to be a Christian, you know, you don't do that. And all this other stuff that people are so obsessed about, right? You're going to go to the church or believe in this, or don't put your penis in a man's anus and stuff like that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. What matters is that you do not join a mob and turn against the scapegoat. That is the absolute core of Christianity.
But within Christianity, the Antichrist is also present. Like that just occurred to me when you were talking. Why would Christians burn witches? Because when Christ comes along, the Antichrist arises simultaneously.
Yes, the Antichrist is basically the person who uses moral grandstanding to make more scapegoats. That's the Antichrist. The Antichrist is saying, like, we are going to stop the scapegoating mechanism by making more scapegoats. That's the Antichrist. Yeah. So that's basically the person who uses moral teachings to make scapegoats. No. That's the Antichrist.
Very good. So I propose that we move to the Wonder Room and move into, let's say, more ritual time with a drink and casual conversation. And everybody's invited. So
how do you join that the Wonder Room?
Where's Owen? Owen, can you put the link to the Wonder Room in the chat?
Yes, I can find it, unless Anise has it to hand. Anise often posts it, otherwise I can.
Oh, right. Oh, there you are, Anise. Great. And so that people who are, so before I shut this operation down, that the Wonder Room link is, the people can grab that link and come and join us just for a drink and a casual conversation. And I want to thank Tomas. I think it's really great to unpack these ideas, because I've heard you speak about them so many times, but also when we unpack it in a conversation like this, it's really clarifying and very great. So I really enjoyed that. Thanks so much for coming.
Yeah, you're welcome. I think it was a lot of fun. Also fun questions. So I really enjoyed it.